This week on the Communicators, a discussion about the Internet with Rod Beckstom, the head of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers.
This week on the Communicators, we're pleased to have the President and CEO of ICANN, Rod Beckstom. Mr. Beckstom, thank you for being with us. Start by explaining what ICANN is, if you would.
Sure. ICANN is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, and there's basically four things that we do that are related. We set the global policies for all 200 million Internet domain names, so all names in the world have to be unique. We enforce that integrity through our partners around the world. We keep the master listing of all Internet addresses, or we have the allocation policies to distribute those internationally. So names and addresses, and then the system that links names and addresses so the Internet actually works when you type in, say, cspan.org or you type in google.com, so you actually get to the right Internet address. That's called the domain name system. We help to coordinate that with many different partners around the world. And then finally, we're the master repository for all of the Internet standards. They're called parameters and protocols that hold the Internet together. There's over 1,000 standards. Those are developed by engineers around the world through the Internet Engineering Task Force, but we're the official publisher of that. So we have names, we have network addresses, domain name system, and then the standards and protocols, some of the glue that helps keep the web and the Internet together.
How and when did ICANN start?
ICANN was founded in 1998, and it was created by the U.S. government at the request of international countries and other partners to spin these name and address activities out of the government into a private sector multi-stakeholder body. So we're a nonprofit organization based in California, but our board of directors is very international. 16 out of the 22 are from around the world. So we're very international, although we're headquartered in the United States.
How is it funded?
We're funded by fees on the registration of domain names. So when a registry such as a .com or a .org or a .net or .edu registers a name, typically that registry pays us around 20 cents per name per year, and then we also get a small fee per name from the registrar, an entity like GoDaddy that consumers think about going to a site, or register.com. When you go and register that domain name, about another 18 cents or so goes to ICANN. So that's how we get our funding, is off the registration of domain names primarily. There's some other minor sources as well.
So no government funding at this point?
Zero government funding.
And being the organization that you are, is there government oversight?
Well, there was some government oversight in a form until October the 1st from the U.S. government, where we published reviews to the U.S. government on a periodic basis. And that was done to make sure that we lived up to a standard of becoming this multi-stakeholder group, because when we were formed only 11 years ago, Peter, there was only one real commercial registry then and one registrar. We were supposed to create this ecosystem of competitive parties. There's now 11 different main registries, 269 in total, and over 900 registrars. So we had to prove that we could create that ecosystem. Since we've done that, the U.S. government said, fine, you accomplished that. Now you should be responsible to the world to be accountable and transparent in how you help to administer your part of the ecosystem.
Well, joining us also in the questioning of Rod Beckstom is Chris Rhodes, who is a technology reporter from the Wall Street Journal. He's in New York. Mr. Rhodes, your first question for Rod Beckstom.
Yes, Rod, I know that ICANN is going to this internationalized domain name program, where the part of the domain name to the right of the dot for the first time will be in non-Roman characters such as Hindi and Chinese and so forth. Why is ICANN doing that now?
The reason we're doing that, Chris, is there's been a consistent call. You know, when the Internet initially got designed, there was a big debate and discussion about whether it should support international scripts or just Latin-based scripts, which we think of as English characters, but they're actually Latinate-based. They're used by most of the Latinate European languages and some others. At the time, the engineers, and this was about 2 decades ago, decided to make it Latin only because there was not a standard for the other languages and scripts. So the Internet Protocol itself that was developed in '73 and other things got created around Latinate script. of course, people from around the world ever since then have been saying, we want everything in our own language. We should be able to write our domain names in Arabic or Chinese. So about 11 years ago, a researcher in Switzerland came up with the idea of saying, well, let's go introduce international domain name languages on top of that Latin-based architecture. That then got picked up in Singapore and China. 11 years of technical work later, there is a standard emerging called IDNA, or International Domain Name for Applications, which the IETF has developed, the engineers. And then 9 years of policy work later, because there's a lot of subtle issues, we're finally ready to roll it out. There's been about 2 years of technical testing of having these international domain names in the internet and what we call the root system for testing. That has gone successfully. So it's taken all those years, Chris. I know it's a long time, but finally we're ready to begin rolling that out. So we'll start accepting applications November 16th in just a few days here, and then hope to put those into the internet route mid next year.
You know, we here in the U.S., where the internet was created, have had a big advantage, of course, by being English speakers, and other English speakers around the world have had that same advantage in terms of using the internet. And now with this going to these non-Roman characters, is something lost? Obviously something is gained in those countries, but is something lost in the sense of the universality of the internet, where we might now start to get a more segmented internet, sort of focused more on individual countries rather than this more global forum?
Both yes and no, Chris. So yes, in ways we're probably going to see larger pockets of content and communities developing in languages that you and I might not recognize. So from our standpoint as Westerners, it might seem fragmented. And yet on the other hand, introducing internationalized domain names so that the 300 million Chinese internet users can use domain names in their native language will actually help to hold the internet unity together. There's been some discussions of parties developing alternative routes to the internet, or what we call forking the route. One of the primary causes people have cited for the interest in that was their inability to use their own native language and scripts in the internet. So there'll be both a proliferation of different communities that you and I may not recognize with our language skills and character sets. At the same time, I think it'll actually help the overall unity technically of the internet to continue. It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah. Do you think that on that point, do you think that it will, by going with these internationalized domain names, do you think that it really will have a real practical effect in terms of how people use the internet, or is it, excuse me, or is it more of a cosmetic change, or a sort of a symbolic change where you're saying to the rest of the world, we see you, we recognize that most of the users now are outside of the U.S., outside of English-speaking countries. Right. So we're making this step for you, recognizing that. But in terms of the practical effect, creating more internet users and so forth, you really think there'll be much of a difference? You know,
we'll see. I think it'll be a little bit of both, Chris. So first off, let's talk about the symbolism. I mean, this is really important to people. I think it's an issue of national pride, cultural pride, that people want to be able to use this global shared resource, the internet, fully in their own languages. Let's talk about the practical side then as well. On the practical side, if you're a housewife in Korea, okay, or a businessman in China who only speaks Korean or Chinese, your keyboard is laid out for Korean or Chinese. When you do your word processing, you would write in Korean or Chinese on your keyboard, and then to go do a domain name, you'd have to go flip your keyboard mode and work in a second language. That's quite an inconvenience for people, and it makes it non-intuitive and just a little bit of a barrier. The other thing that we've learned in some of the testing, Chris, is that the biggest uptake of the international domain names is small local businesses. So it's not the big global brands, you know, that everyone knows in Latin characters. It's the local restaurant or the park or the police station that has a local identity that people think of in Chinese characters, for example, they'd never think of that, you know, police station or that local restaurant in a Latinx character. So we'll see. Chris, I would expect to see more proliferation there initially in the smaller businesses and groups around the world. But ultimately, we'll see whether this is just a psychic issue, you know, and a pride issue, or whether it really opens up the floodgates for a lot of new domain names and content and sites. We'll see.
Mr. Beckstrom, is there a security issue involved with this, or a security concern involved with opening this up?
There are, Peter, and anytime you do anything in the internet, you know, we tend to use open standards in opening it up. Most people are good, so they'll use the new open standards and the new capabilities for good purposes. Some people are bad, some people are very bad, and they'll try to take any new technology, any new standard, and find a way to use that to, whether, you know, steal money or extort money, or, you know, cyber crimes is a really serious problem. And concerns around some of the security issues on international domain names is part of why it's taken 9 years to develop the policies. A simple example would be in a script like Cyrillic, which the Russians use, there are some letters, they have a letter that looks just like our letter A, but it's a different letter. Well, if you allow someone to mix English script with Russian script in a name, they could put the letter A in something and make it look like eBay, for example, or something, when it really wasn't. It was a different site with, you know, an E, a B, and a Russian letter, and then something else. So we have banned that. So in international domain names, the string has to be consistently in international characters to avoid what we call spoofing. You know, spoofing is when someone tries to make a website look like someone else's website to get their password or steal their money. So a lot of the policy development in IDNs, international domain names, has been designed to reduce some of the security risks and fraud. So will there be security issues? Always will be with any new technology. But the policy work has been created in cooperation with law enforcement participation and many other parties to try and at least minimize those impacts.
Where does ICANN's authority derive from?
Our authority really derives from the community and from the fact that we have registrars active in our community, ISPs, registries, governments. We have 99 governments on our government advisory committee. We have private sector groups, civil society, privacy groups, you know, environment. I mean, everybody comes to ICANN. There's probably somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people come and participate in these policy processes and meetings each year.
But are there governments that don't recognize ICANN's authority?
In general, I would say they accept ICANN's role because ICANN is facilitating the internet functioning from a names and addresses standpoint. There are some governments who might like to see that formally government controlled by some kind of other governmental body, but I'd say in general the buy-in's quite good. We were very pleased, Peter, for example, when China just came and formally rejoined our government advisory committee just in June of this year. That was a big development. One of the other few major countries that's not yet formally at the table is Russia, and that's actually because of some very subtle legal issues, and perhaps that's something that'll change in the future.
Does that prevent them from using the internet in any way?
Oh, absolutely. The Russians use it very actively. They're active in the stakeholder processes, and there seems to be an expression of interest in international domain names. In fact, President Medvedev just got a briefing 2 days ago that's online, a live television broadcast of him being briefed by the Minister of Telecommunications on international domain names and how they intend to work on the Cyrillic alphabet, which of course means a lot to them. So, you know, in general, we see very good government buy-in to what we're doing. But sometimes governments aren't used to private corporations and the nonprofits in many ways having an equal seat at the table in policy formulation.
This is the Communicators program. Our guest is Rod Beckstrom, who is president of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, also known as ICANN. Joining us from New York is Chris Rhodes of the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Rhodes, next question.
On the point that Peter raised a minute ago about the security side of this, Rod, of course, this is an area you know well as head of cybersecurity for the Department of Homeland Defense. How big of an issue is this going to be for ICANN, and will that be part of ICANN's role going forward, to play a bigger role bigger part in the cybersecurity area?
It's a great question, Chris. You know, what role are we going to play in cybersecurity? And we have certain touch points. So there's certain things we can do in cybersecurity, and there's certain things that we absolutely cannot do. We're fundamentally a bottom-up, community-driven organization, and so we have to be sensitive to the role that ISPs want us to be engaged in, governments around the world, and all those stakeholders. The piece that we are charged with focusing on is the security of the domain name system. The system that when we type in cspan.org, for example, into a browser, it invokes the domain name system that comes back with a network address. That system is used hundreds of billions of times per day. It can be used by hackers, in particular in these new what are called botnet attacks, where people install their malware on, say, hundreds of thousands of machines or millions, and they can command them to go do bad things. Those botnet systems tend to leverage the domain name system because they have to move their control point. Otherwise, you can shut them down if you know what the control point is and you shut down that web address or that domain address and that network address. So we have a special focus on the domain name system. The other thing about ICANN that's unique is we have to be like Switzerland. Okay, so there's cyber defense and there's cyber offense. We can have nothing to do with offense anywhere, okay? We can focus only on defense, and we have to remain as neutral as Switzerland because we have 240 countries around the world that we deal with and territories. Everything from the US to all the European partners to Syria, Iran, North Korea. I mean, everyone has some presence on the internet, and their relationship for their country code domains is with ICANN. So we effectively work with everyone in the world. So we have to stay very neutral, and we have to focus on supporting security of the domain name system through and with our partners. So it's a tricky game we have to play of staying in the middle.
Chris Rhodes.
The computer viruses and other types of computer attacks, of course, are nothing new. They've existed since the beginning of the internet.
Sure.
But it seems like they are getting more sophisticated by the minute, and just the power of these things growing exponentially. What's your current assessment of the state of where things are right now in terms of the level of this cyber activity, illegal activity, attacks, and the ability of the good guys to fight against that? Obviously, it's a up and down situation, but what's your sense of the current situation, and how serious is this for using the internet as we know it?
Sure. Well, it's a very serious issue, Chris, as you point out. I would say in the short term, things have been getting worse, okay? The trend line in the last 24 months has been many more viruses, more sophisticated botnets. There's one out there that's very nasty called Conficker that much of the world has been fighting now for, I think, around a year. Conficker is still on at least 3 or 5 million machines, okay? And it's a very pernicious botnet. It hasn't been used for bad yet, but could be. And ICANN's role was helping get another 100 countries in to join the battle against Conficker because, again, we're that neutral meeting place. But I think in the short term, Chris, I think the bad guys are getting a bit of the upper hand. They're networking very well internationally, so you're seeing European cyber criminals linking with some in Latin America or the Middle East and Asia. Very sophisticated techniques. A lot of financial crimes that are taking place and others, and this is really a world-class problem, and it's one I think can only be solved by better international collaboration between the parties. But as consumers, we've got to be very careful on our own machines, and I think we should all think twice before doing all of our banking online, for example. You want to be really careful in how you approach. I do my online banking with a separate machine that is only plugged in for maybe 2 minutes a week to execute those transactions, and otherwise there's no financial records on any of my other computers. I have a dedicated laptop. That's all it's used for.
Do you advise that for everybody?
The good news is with netbooks and PCs getting as cheap as $200 each or $400, look, I think it's not a bad practice. What I'm trying to do is limit access people might have to my financial records. And now an alternative is to stop using online banking completely. I'm not advocating that, but there are programs now called keystroke loggers that can get loaded onto your machine just by looking at one image or one video. And then someone has the ability to track every keystroke you're doing, including your passwords. And so they can look at your keystrokes and see that you go to a banking website, capture your password, and then use that to take your funds.
Millions of people online bank on their normal computers.
Yes.
Or on a remote computer, work computer, whatever it is.
Yes.
Has the danger increased, or what's being done to stop that?
Well, maybe my paranoia increased. You know, I went to direct the National Cybersecurity Center, and when you work on those kinds of problems, you really get a sense of the scale of activity and how pernicious it can be. So, you know, maybe I'm in the school of overly paranoid people, having had that experience, or you could say more aware. I think people should be quite cautious. Now, the banks have been, and the credit card companies have been very good, you know, in general, to cover most of the customer losses that have come from this. But even like I learned, you know, one of my credit cards last month was just canceled. There's nothing I did. I was just told, you know, your credit card's been compromised. You know, no explanation of how and where and why. But probably, my guess is, someone broke into a computer system somewhere and might have gotten a copy of that credit card data, whether from a credit card company or one of their vendors or someone else. So, look, there's a lot of good work going on in industry and of parties around the world, but cybercrime is a very real thing, and I just encourage people to use caution. By the way, there's a good online program to do some training on how not to get tricked called Anti-Phishing Phil. It's a game online that teaches you to avoid certain web links and certain names that might come up, just as an FYI.
Chris Rhodes, next question for Rod Beckstrom.
The other big change that seems to be coming down the pipeline for ICANN is this opening up the domain name process, meaning making it a lot easier to create new top-level domain names, the part of the domain name to the right of the dot, such as .com or .net. And if I understand it correctly, we're going to soon have the ability to create a whole host of possibilities, .airport, .coke, .ibm, .car, whatever. I mean, as it relates to the security issue we were just talking about, some I know are worried that having this increase of domain names could make it a lot easier for the bad guys out there to trick people and do their bad things. What do you think about that?
You know, let me talk through some of the factors, and I'll give you my sort of gut sense on it. Now, my gut sense is that overall, having new generic top-level domains will lead to more security. But let me explain why, and then let me also say why that's uncertain, because there's a lot of different factors. One is that the new parties that create what we call generic top-level domains, like .airport or something like that, will have to sign a formal contract with ICANN and agree to a set of security standards that previous domains did not have to. They're going to have to use what's called DNS Secure or DNSSEC, a secure domain name system that uses digital certificates, so you really know you're getting to the website you want to get to. So that's a higher security requirement that new GTLDs will have to do. That's the current proposal. The program's still under development. They'll have to be able to support IPv6 is the current proposal, which is a new form of Internet Protocol version 6, which has some further attributes that can be useful to security. And moreover, they have a contract with us where they're going to have to avoid certain practices that they might have been able to do in other domains in the past. For example, the country code domains around the world, with many of the country groups, we have no contracts. We have a working relationship, but for sovereignty issue, many communities and countries have said, we're not going to sign a contract with ICANN. So over those country code domains, of which there's roughly 240, we do not have contracts in many cases, so we can't dictate or develop security standards. It's totally optional. So there's that set of issues. There's another issue, Chris, if we look at typo squatting. So if you misspell a common name trying to go to, you mentioned Coke.com or IBM.com. Well, let's say you misspell some of those words, .com. In some cases, you will go to a site that is held by a hostile party who's trying to generate transactions off of that. That's called typo squatting. Typo squatting won't be possible in a top-level domain unless your browser's not working properly. When that false falsely spelled request goes to the domain name system, it will be rejected, because we're not going to approve any applications of typo squatting parties. And in fact, to approve a new GTLD, we're going to do background checks on the individual officers of the company. We're going to look at the history of litigation of the companies, how many disputes they've had over domain names. So we get to kind of do a lot of quality control around these new offerings that we have not been able to do historically. So my gut sense is that consumers are not going to be that confused. In fact, by going directly to the name, let's just say hypothetically C-SPAN got a top-level domain, then they wouldn't go to cspan.org anymore. They would just go to C-SPAN, so Peter at C-SPAN, okay? And so arguably there could be a higher level of security. My gut sense is there will be because of the quality control mechanism. But at the same time, all these issues are complex. They're multivariate. You know, thieves and criminals will try to figure out how to use any system to create harm, and so we're going to have to keep an eye on it and possibly evolve the practices and policies as well.
Mr. Beckstrom, how did you get into this work?
How did I get into this work? Well, it's a long story. I was a high-tech CEO historically, and started a company, took it public, and sold that when I was fairly young. And then I did different social service projects mostly. And I was in New York on 9/11, and my life changed that day. And I stopped all my business work, and for 3.5 years, I worked on building a network of CEOs to work on peace across the Middle East and around the world. That work led to insights about how decentralized human and technical networks work. We were studying Al-Qaeda and building our own decentralized network. That led to a book called The Starfish and Spider. That got read by cabinet members and senior leaders in U.S. government. I then got recruited to help the U.S. government using some of these concepts and ideas for counterterrorism and cybersecurity. Did my job in the U.S. government for a while, missed my family, went home, and ICANN called me. ICANN was looking for a new CEO, and their search firm, Aegon Zender, gave me a call and said, you know, we've got the perfect job for you, and all you have to do is move to LA instead of commuting to DC. And I said, I'm not moving to LA. So fortunately, we came out with an understanding, and they allowed me to work out of Palo Alto. And we have a lot of travel around the world anyway. And of course, Palo Alto was the second site in the world ever connected by the internet. So a bit appropriate. So anyway, so
the first being?
Yeah, the first was Los Angeles at the UCLA campus. So UCLA to Palo Alto at Stanford Research Institute was the first connection of the internet, or the ARPANET, 40 years ago, October '69.
Chris Rhodes, time for one more question.
ICANN is obviously a unique beast, and you've been there now for I guess for 4 or 5 months or so.
That's right.
What has been your biggest surprise, either positive or negative, since you've been there?
The biggest surprise, Chris, is just the massive volume of communications, activity. The stakeholder groups are generating, you know, roughly there's our board books. We have a board meeting every month. There's 350 pages of new material every month of policy work on subtle issues around the world, whether it's IDNs or GTLDs. So massive amount of documents, thousands of people involved. And the economic stakes are so massive, and we're this tiny little nonprofit organization in the middle. I mean, we're only $60 million a year nonprofit, which is tiny, with this gargantuan multi-trillion-dollar industry and billion-dollar players all fighting over kind of the economic outcomes of these policies. So I guess what's really surprised me, Chris, is just the power of these tectonic forces that are hitting the internet, and us having that little role in the middle in names and numbers, protocols, and DNS, and how that's all coming together. But I'm thrilled to be here. It's a really fascinating
And I don't
exercise.
mean to keep driving this point, but again, how do you get that authority? What makes you keep that authority? And do you foresee that an organization such as ICANN going out of business because of all these forces?
No, actually the forces are coming to the table and they're getting more engaged. So even like GTLDs has got a lot of businesses concerns about both the upside and the downside. It's bringing more businesses into the ICANN community, getting much more involved. No one ultimately has authority over the internet. It is the ultimate collaboration environment. If we're not doing our job at the end of the day, or if the Chinese are upset or another party's upset, they can always create their own internet route, okay? The network effect tends to bring people back in, the benefit of being connected to the rest of the world. But our only authority really derives from the community of Internet users, and our partnerships with IETF, with ISOC, the Engineering Society, and all the other players in the ecosystem. So we have a very humble role to play. It's a small little role, and we have to do our best to be a fair meeting place and to let the Internet name and number space evolve.
And finally, Mr. Beckstrom, are you familiar with ICANNwatch.org, the organization that reports on what ICANN does and not necessarily always positively?
We have a lot of critics inside and outside the community, and that's part of what makes, I think, any multi-stakeholder process fair and open.
And there's some traffic on ICANN Watch about what happened on October 1st, and some constitutionality concerns and some sovereignty concerns. How do you address those?
First, I'm not a lawyer. I'll explain that. You know, I'm more of a business guy, technology guy, and a bit of government policy. I'm not an attorney. There are some subtle legal issues that some parties have tried to represent that they're concerned about sovereignty. On the other hand, the preponderance of our community is absolutely delighted with the outcome on October 1st, including thousands of attorneys around the world who think it's a terrific thing. So, and I think that may have been written by someone I know who's a very articulate and intelligent critic and watcher of ICANN, and actually someone who's contributed a lot. So I think we need to consider that issue, but by and large, the world has spoken, and the world is very pleased with the affirmation of commitment, and even more countries are already coming to the table to engage. So we view it as positive. But there will always be criticism, and that's a great thing.
Rod Beckstrom is president of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Chris Rhodes is a technology reporter with the Wall Street Journal. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.